Long before multivitamins, before wellness influencers, before anyone ever charged you $15 for a green juice, there was a list of foods so effective at keeping the human body running that entire civilizations built their diets, their economies, and even their religious rituals around them. And a strange number of those foods show up again and again in the pages of the Bible. Not as background details, not as throwaway mentions, as central, repeated, deliberately chosen parts of the text. Kings were anointed with one of them. A prophet used another as medicine on a dying man. Desperate travelers wept in the desert because they missed one so badly they could barely stand it. For most of history, people read these passages as spiritual symbolism and nothing more. But over the last few decades, nutrition scientists, biochemists, and clinical researchers have gone back to these exact foods, one at a time, and started running them through modern testing. And what they keep finding is strange. The ancient world wasn't guessing. It was working with a level of nutritional precision that we are only now catching up to. Today we're going through 10 of these foods. Real biblical references paired with real clinical research, so you can see exactly why these particular foods earned their place in Scripture and why some of them might deserve a place back on your plate. Stick around, because the food at the very top of this list is mentioned more than any other food in the entire Bible, and the reason why will genuinely surprise you. Let's start. Number 10, lentils. Lentils don't get much attention today. They're cheap, they're plain looking, and they don't photograph well for a wellness ad. But in the ancient Near East, lentils were serious currency. In the book of Genesis, Esau sells his birthright, his entire inheritance, to his brother Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. Think about how significant that detail is. The writers didn't pick a rare delicacy to make that trade feel dramatic. They picked lentils because everyone reading it would understand instantly why a starving man might make a desperate decision over a bowl of them. Here's why that makes sense nutritionally. Lentils are one of the most complete plant-based protein sources available, delivering roughly 18 grams of protein per cooked cup, along with enormous amounts of soluble fiber. That fiber does something specific. It slows digestion, which blunts blood sugar spikes and keeps hunger away for hours. This is likely exactly why a bowl of lentil stew was enough to make an exhausted, famished man feel like it was worth trading away his future for. Modern research on lentils has focused heavily on cardiovascular health. Multiple clinical studies have linked regular legume consumption, lentils specifically, to lower LDL cholesterol and improved blood pressure regulation. They're also loaded with folate, iron, and resistant starch, a type of carbohydrate that isn't fully digested in the small intestine and instead travels to the colon, where it feeds beneficial bacteria and has been associated with improved insulin sensitivity. There's also an underappreciated detail here. Lentils contain polyphenols concentrated mostly in their seed coat, giving darker lentils, like black beluga or French green lentils, meaningfully higher antioxidant activity than the more common red or yellow varieties. So if you're choosing between them, the darker the lentil, the more protective compounds you're getting. Traditional preparation was simple. Slow simmered with onions, garlic, and olive oil, sometimes with a bit of grain added to round out the amino acid profile. It's humble food. It's also one of the most metabolically stabilizing things you can put on a plate. Number 9. Grapes and wine. Grapes and wine appear so frequently across biblical scripture that entire chapters are structured around vineyard imagery. Wine is served at feasts, offered in ritual, and used by Jesus at the Last Supper as a central symbol. This wasn't incidental. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the grapevine was one of the most economically and culturally significant plants in existence. What's interesting is what modern research has found inside the grape itself, particularly in the skin and seeds. Grapes contain resveratrol, a polyphenol produced by the plant as a natural defense compound, and it has become one of the most studied molecules in the entire field of longevity research. Laboratory and animal studies have shown resveratrol activates certain cellular pathways associated with stress resistance and mitochondrial function, the kind of pathways linked to the effects seen in caloric restriction. Human trials are more limited and results are mixed, but consistent findings include modest improvements in blood vessel function and reductions in markers of oxidative stress. Grapes as a whole fruit, not just the extracted compound, are also rich in quercetin and anthocyanins, particularly in darker red and purple varieties, both linked to reduced inflammation and improved vascular health in observational studies. As for wine specifically, the research is genuinely nuanced and worth being honest about. Some population studies, particularly out of Mediterranean cohorts, have associated light to moderate wine consumption with lower cardiovascular risk. But more recent, larger analyses have pushed back hard on the idea that any amount of alcohol is protective, and most public health bodies now caution against recommending alcohol for health reasons at all. So the honest takeaway isn't drink wine for your heart, it's that the compounds inside grapes themselves, eaten as fruit, carry real documented benefits without the trade-offs that come with alcohol. Traditionally, grapes were eaten fresh in season and dried into raisins for the months when fresh fruit wasn't available, which concentrated both the sugars and the polyphenols into a dense, portable food that traveled well across long journeys. Number 8. Barley. Barley was not a luxury grain. It was the grain of soldiers, laborers, and ordinary households who couldn't always afford wheat. When Jesus fed a crowd of thousands with a small number of loaves and fish in the Gospel of John, those loaves were barley loaves, the bread of people who had very little. And it turns out the poor man's grain was nutritionally outperforming the wealthier alternative. Barley contains the highest concentration of a soluble fiber called beta-glucan found in any cereal grain on the planet. This isn't a minor nutritional footnote either. The evidence behind beta-glucan is strong enough that regulatory health bodies, including the FDA, have approved specific cholesterol-lowering health claims for foods that contain it. Here's the mechanism. Beta-glucan forms a thick, viscous gel as it moves through the digestive tract. That gel physically slows down how quickly sugar is absorbed into the bloodstream after a meal, which flattens the blood sugar spike you'd otherwise get. It also binds to bile acids made from cholesterol, and the body then has to pull more cholesterol out of the blood to replace them, which is the mechanism behind barley's LDL lowering effect. Head-to-head clinical comparisons between barley and oats, which is already considered a gold standard heart-healthy grain, have shown barley producing a gentler post-meal blood sugar response in several trials. Barley also has a lower glycemic index than both wheat and white rice, meaning it releases energy more slowly and steadily. For thousands of years, this was simply how ordinary people ate. Whole barley boiled into a thick porridge, ground for flatbread, or added to stews to bulk them out. The hulled, less processed version retains far more of the fiber and nutrients than the more common pearled barley found in grocery stores today. So if you're shopping for it, hulled is the better choice when you can find it. Number 7. Figs. There's a specific moment in the second book of Kings that reads almost like a medical case file. King Hezekiah is severely ill from an infected boil, and the prophet Isaiah doesn't just offer a prayer. He gives a direct treatment instruction: press a cake of figs onto the wound. The king recovers. For a long time, this was read purely as symbolic. But when researchers actually started analyzing the biochemistry of figs, the prescription turned out to have a real physiological basis. Figs contain an enzyme called phycin, a proteolytic enzyme that breaks down damaged and dead tissue, similar in function to enzymes used in some modern debridement treatments for wounds. The milky lentex found in unripe fig skin has also demonstrated antimicrobial activity against several bacterial strains in laboratory studies. Isaiah's fig compress wasn't folk superstition. It was a plausible, biochemically grounded intervention for the medical tools available at the time. As food, figs are just as impressive. They're one of the most mineral-dense fruits available, rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and manganese, in a way that made them functionally close to a daily multivitamin in a world with no such thing. They're also unusually high in soluble fiber, particularly pectin, which supports a diverse gut microbiome and has been linked in several studies to improved cholesterol markers. Fresh figs, eaten in season, deliver fast, easily digestible natural sugars alongside that mineral load. Dried figs concentrate all of that into a shelf-stable form that could carry nutrition through the parts of the year when fresh fruit simply wasn't available. Which is exactly why dried figs were a staple food across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East for so long. Number 6. Pomegranates. The pillars of Solomon's temple, according to the biblical description in the Book of Kings, were decorated with rows of carved pomegranates, 200 of them on each pillar. In a culture where architectural ornamentation was never random, that's a striking level of deliberate emphasis placed on a single fruit. Modern research gives us a fairly compelling explanation for why. Pomegranates contain a class of compounds called punicologens, found in very few other food sources, which the gut microbiome converts into metabolites called urolithins. Urolithins have become a genuine hotspot in aging and mitochondrial research over the last decade, with laboratory studies showing they can trigger a cellular cleanup process called mitophagy, essentially helping cells clear out damaged mitochondria. This research is still developing, mostly in early-phase human trials, but the direction of the findings has been consistent enough that several companies have built supplements specifically around isolated urolithin compounds. Beyond that, clinical trials using pomegranate juice have shown measurable reductions in systolic blood pressure, improvements in arterial stiffness, and lower oxidation of LDL cholesterol, a process considered a key early step in the development of atherosclerosis. Pomegranates also test remarkably high in total polyphenol content, in several comparisons outranking green tea and red wine, two foods frequently held up as antioxidant benchmarks. Most of the medicinal use historically wasn't limited to the arils, the juicy seed pockets people eat today. Traditional healers across the Middle East also dried and brewed the rind, which carries an even higher concentration of tannins, into a tea used for digestive complaints, a practice modern researchers are now revisiting for its antimicrobial properties. Number 5. Dates. Dates are referenced across biblical and broader ancient Near Eastern texts more than almost any other fruit-bearing tree, and there's a practical reason for that. Date palms could survive and produce fruit in some of the harshest, driest terrain on Earth, which made them one of the only reliable calorie sources for people crossing desert regions on foot. Nutritionally, dates are dense. A single serving delivers a meaningful amount of magnesium, potassium, copper, manganese, and B vitamins, wrapped around a concentrated load of natural sugar. That sugar comes with enough fiber attached that the resulting blood sugar response is considerably gentler than an equivalent amount of refined sugar would produce. One of the more interesting bodies of research on dates comes from obstetrics. Several controlled clinical trials have looked at women who consume dates regularly during the final weeks of pregnancy and found associations with shorter active labor and more favorable cervical readiness at admission compared to women who didn't. Researchers believe this may be related to compounds in dates that interact with the same receptor pathways as oxytocin, though the exact mechanism is still being studied. Traditional midwifery across the region prescribed dates for exactly this purpose, long before anyone understood why it worked. Dates also contain tannins and polyphenols with documented antimicrobial activity, and in traditional Arabic medicine, even the pits were ground down and used for digestive complaints, meaning almost nothing about the fruit went to waste. Their portability and shelf stability made them a natural staple for travelers, and this is likely the same underlying logic behind the long-standing custom of breaking a fast with a few dates first. They deliver fast, steady energy to a body that hasn't eaten in hours, without the jarring spike of refined sugar. Number 4. Fish. Fish shows up constantly across Scripture, from the miraculous catch described in the Gospels to the fish the Israelites reminisced about eating in Egypt. In a region built around the Mediterranean Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and the Nile, fish wasn't a luxury food. It was one of the most consistent protein sources available to ordinary people, and it happens to be one of the best studied foods in modern cardiovascular research. The reason comes down to omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, found in high concentrations in fattier fish like sardines, mackerel, and the freshwater fish common to the Sea of Galilee. Large-scale population studies and clinical trials have linked regular fish consumption to lower rates of cardiovascular disease, reduced triglyceride levels, and improved heart rhythm stability. DHA in particular is a major structural component of the brain and retina, and it's one of the reasons fish consumption has been so heavily studied in relation to cognitive health across the lifespan. Fish also provides highly bioavailable protein alongside vitamin D and selenium, two nutrients that were historically difficult to source consistently from a plant-based diet alone. In a world without fortified foods or supplements, a diet that regularly included fish was covering nutritional gaps that grain and produce simply couldn't fill on their own. The way it was prepared mattered too. Fish across the ancient Mediterranean world was commonly salted or dried for preservation, a practice that, while it increased sodium content, allowed the nutritional value to travel and last far beyond the day it was caught. Number 3, garlic and onions. These two show up together in one of the most emotionally raw moments in the entire Torah. Wandering in the wilderness and surviving only on manna, the Israelites break down in complaint, and what they specifically say they miss is startling in its detail: the fish of Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. People who had just been freed from slavery were mourning the loss of an allium harvest. That's not a small detail. That's a genuine craving rooted in something their bodies were used to. Once you look at what garlic and onions actually do physiologically, that grief makes a lot more sense. When garlic is crushed or chopped, an enzymatic reaction produces a compound called allicin, one of the broadest spectrum natural antimicrobials that's been studied, showing measurable activity against bacteria, viruses, and fungi in laboratory research. Clinical trials have linked regular garlic consumption to reductions in both the frequency and duration of common colds, along with meaningful reductions in LDL cholesterol and blood pressure. Garlic also reduces platelet aggregation, meaning it makes blood somewhat less prone to clotting. The key detail researchers emphasize is that allicin is heat sensitive and begins breaking down once garlic is cooked, so raw or freshly crushed garlic carries considerably more of this activity than the cooked version, even though both were used historically. Onions bring a different but equally important set of compounds, particularly quercetin, one of the most extensively studied polyphenols in nutrition science, linked to reduced inflammation, lower blood pressure, and stabilized histamine response. Onions are also rich in inulin, a prebiotic fiber that passes undigested into the colon, where it selectively feeds beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria. There's also a well-documented historical detail worth mentioning here. Records indicate that laborers who built the Egyptian pyramids were partly compensated with rations of onions and garlic, which tells you these weren't seasoning, they were treated as essential food. Number 2, honey. Eat honey, for it is good, reads a line from Proverbs, and honey is referenced across scripture more consistently than almost any other single food, tied repeatedly to strength, sweetness, and healing. Honey has one of the most well-documented antimicrobial track records of any natural food in the scientific literature. It works through several mechanisms at once. It generates small amounts of hydrogen peroxide through an enzymatic reaction. Its extremely low water content and acidic pH create conditions most bacteria can't survive in. And it contains a specific peptide called defensin-1 that actively damages bacterial cell structures. This isn't fringe research either. Medical-grade honey, most commonly Manuka honey from New Zealand, is used today in certified wound dressings in hospitals as a standard clinical treatment, not an alternative therapy. The critical detail is that this antimicrobial power depends heavily on the honey being raw and minimally processed. Once honey is heated above roughly 40 degrees Celsius, which most commercial honey is, during filtering and pasteurization for shelf stability and clarity, many of the enzymes responsible for its therapeutic activity begin to break down. The smooth, perfectly clear honey sold in most grocery stores has effectively been converted from a functional food into something closer to flavored syrup. Raw honey applied to minor wounds can help prevent infection and support healing, and there's reasonable clinical evidence that a spoonful at the first sign of a sore throat or cough can meaningfully soothe irritation, in some studies performing comparably to over-the-counter cough suppressants in children over 1 year old. It's also genuinely one of the only foods on Earth with near-indefinite shelf life. Archaeologists have recovered honey from Egyptian tombs thousands of years old that remained chemically stable and edible, a preservation quality almost no other natural food can match. And now, number 1, olive oil. There's a reason this one sits at the top. Olive oil is referenced well over 100 times across biblical scripture, more than any other single food. Kings and priests were anointed with it, lamps were fueled by it, And in the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan describes him pouring oil and wine directly into a wounded stranger's injuries, an act of practical medical care, not just gesture. Extra virgin olive oil is now one of the single most rigorously studied foods in all of nutritional science. It sits at the center of the Mediterranean diet, which has been examined across hundreds of large-scale clinical trials and consistently linked to significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, cognitive decline, type 2 diabetes, and overall mortality. Few individual foods in the entire research literature carry this weight of consistent, replicated evidence behind them. Much of that effect is credited to a compound called oleocanthal, a polyphenol found specifically in high-quality extra virgin olive oil, which has been shown to inhibit the same inflammatory pathway, COX enzymes, that ibuprofen targets. Since chronic low-grade inflammation is now understood to be an underlying driver of most major modern diseases, a daily food capable of interrupting that pathway without pharmaceutical side effects is a genuinely significant thing to have access to. Olive oil also delivers meaningful amounts of vitamin E and vitamin K, alongside a broad spectrum of antioxidant polyphenols that protect cells from oxidative stress. Its fat profile is predominantly monounsaturated, a type of fat the human body metabolizes efficiently and that doesn't provoke the same inflammatory response associated with many refined industrial seed oils. But there's an important distinction worth knowing before you shop for it. A large amount of what's sold as olive oil today isn't equivalent to what was used in the ancient world. Studies auditing commercial olive oil have found that a significant share is harvested later than ideal, blended with cheaper refined oils or processed with heat that degrades much of its polyphenol content, meaning it no longer provides the same benefits. Genuine extra virgin, cold-pressed, early harvest olive oil, ideally from a source that can verify its production, is the version that carries the antioxidant density researchers are actually studying. So there they are. 10 foods tracked from ancient scripture straight through to modern clinical research, and it's worth sitting with what that actually means. None of these benefits required a laboratory to be discovered in the first place. They were identified the slow way, through generations of people eating these foods, observing what happened to their bodies over time, and building entire agricultural systems, trade routes, and rituals around what they noticed. Modern science didn't invent these findings. It caught up to them, confirming through clinical trials and biochemical analysis what careful observation had already worked out thousands of years earlier. That's genuinely worth thinking about the next time you're standing in a grocery store aisle. So much of what's sold as food today, refined oils, bleached grains, pasteurized honey stripped of its active enzymes, barely resembles what these texts were actually describing. It's a modern imitation wearing the same name. Here's a simple way to actually use everything you just heard. Pick 2 foods from this list, just 2. Find the highest quality version you can reasonably source and build them genuinely into how you eat for the next month, not as a supplement you take on the side, but as actual food. Then pay attention to how you feel, the same way people did for thousands of years before any of this had a name. If something on this list surprised you, I'd genuinely like to know which one. Was it the figs used as a wound treatment? The lentils that were valuable enough to trade away an inheritance? The honey still edible after 3,000 years in a tomb? Drop it in the comments, I read all of them. And if you want more of this, subscribe and turn on notifications because there's another one of these coming soon and it goes even deeper than this one did.